Alright, greetings everyone, this is Robert Rowe. This is going to be my critical response number 2 for the nose flood debate that's taking place. And let's start. So this is my response to Jen Fishbach. The criticisms I received about my opening argument was without merit. I find it curious that Jen didn't review any of the source material I relied on. None of my extensive footnotes of scholarly research were addressed, whether theological or scientific. That being said, here's some highlights of Jen's first critical response that I shall respond to. If I left out anything, it's because I've already addressed them in my opening argument and in my first critical response. She says, I also find it hilarious that both of my opponents thought I would be using Ken Ham's materials. You may not have used his material, but you certainly didn't contradict him. Recall your opening on the size of the Ark, along with all the logistics of how to house thousands aboard. None of what you wrote contradict young Earth creationist literature. Yet none of what you wrote was physically feasible. There weren't thousands aboard the Ark, and neither were such logistics practiced at any time in ancient history. The Bible doesn't give such details, and neither does any other ancient Near Eastern text, because it's physically impossible with such primitive technology at play. Jen then says, we should now read the Bible with a new pair of lenses through that of audience relevance and time statements. That also includes learning to understand their culture, their history, and their language. Well, if that's the case, Jen, congratulations. You have just upheaved your entire original opening and practically all young Earth creationist literature and given credence to Joel's and mine to a certain extent in this context. So you've given credence to Joel's perspective. That once you align Genesis 1 to 11 into an ancient Near Eastern context, the young Earth creationist paradigm comes crashing down because no one in the ancient Near East, including the biblical authors, were young Earth creationists. Then Jen writes, Joel scoffed at the history of the Bible while Robert scoffed at the science of the Bible. I'm sorry. Joel and myself would scoff at the critical scholarship of the Bible, whether historical, theological, or scientific, and then give a positive defense of the Bible. Then Jen then writes, they, which would be those who criticize creation scientists, they admit that at least 152 quote-unquote creation scientists are true scientists in every stretch of the definition. Unfortunately for Robert, I did not appeal to any of them yet, although there is an overabundance of science that lends credence to a worldwide flood. It seems that Jen didn't read the page she was referring to. She was referring to a Rational Wiki page that accurately states, quote, scientific principles are built on publications in peer-reviewed journals, discussions in open forums, and finally consensus. Creationist publications are not counted because creationist journals often qualify as pseudo-journals. Furthermore, you didn't appeal to them. I agree, you didn't appeal to them. Yet you assert that there is scientific evidence for a global flood. The only evidence you will find is via the pseudoscience of young Earth creationist literature. You have yet to show us. In your opening, you haven't done it. In your first critical response, you haven't done it. I hope you'll do it in your second response. But you have yet to show us definitive, non-young Earth creationist scientific evidence for a global flood. Your opening and first response involved conjecture, and I'm arguing that you will not find any. You will find none because there is none. There is no evidence for a global flood. But what you did see me do, which you didn't engage with, Jen, is that I did show empirical scientific evidence for a localized catastrophe in the Persian Gulf roughly 13,000 years ago. You haven't engaged with that. Then Jen says all dating methods are based upon speculation. Now, this is where I literally had to facepalm because I'm in the field, in the physics field, that actually work with this stuff. And I think this is where, when Christians make such statements like this, it really does hinder the gospel. I'm sorry to say that, and I'm sorry to be blunt, but it's just truth. I mean, if you have an atheist viewing this debate right now, and they saw such a statement like that, they would completely switch off from any more that Jen has to say in regards to the topic. I mean, it's not, and I'm not saying this is the only argument she made. There were many arguments similar to this, but here's at least a highlight of what I'm getting at, that you can just hinder your ultimately the gospel message if you if you're deliberately misleading the audience, or you're just showcasing an absolute form of ignorance on the topic. So I'm just going to educate Jen a little bit on what radiometric decay methods are all about. So no, it's not speculation. And that's a key word. Remember that word, speculation. Is it speculation? So major radiometric clocks operate on the principle of half-life decay. Radioactive isotopes disintegrate through time, that is, they decay into lighter elements. For example, plutonium-239 decays into helium-4 and uranium-235. If we start with 10,000 plutonium-239 atoms and wait 24,110 years, we'll only have about 5,000 left. In other words, 24,110 years is the half-life for plutonium-239. After 15 half-lives, a total of 361,650 years, the entire sample of 10,000 plutonium-239 atoms will have decayed into lighter elements. And here's the irony of this fact. The lack of naturally occurring plutonium-239 anywhere in Earth's crust is one reason geologists and geophysicists are convinced Earth must be older than 361,650 years. But it doesn't stop there. In fact, Earth's crust is currently devoid of all short-lived radionuclides. And so it's not just plutonium-239, it's actually neptunium-237 with a half-life of 2.14 million years, aluminium-26 with a half-life of 720,000 years, calcium-41 with a half-life of 103,000 years, iodine-129 with a half-life of 17 million years, technetium-98 with a half-life of 4.2 million years, and plutonium-244 with a half-life of 82 million years. Therefore, the present-day lack of short-lived radionuclides in Earth convinces scientists that Earth and the solar system must be older than 1.245 billion years. So if you times the 15 half-lives by 83 million, you get that figure. However, it doesn't mean that these short-lived radionuclides do not exist elsewhere. In fact, astronomers have detected these radiometric elements in the spectra of stars or the interstellar medium that is demonstrably younger than either Earth or the Sun. They have to be in order for these to exist because they're short-lived. So coming back to the dating question, just as thermometers, barometers, and radar all have specific applications and limits, so too the different radiometric decay dating methods. Now, this is a rule of thumb when you're going to date something. Proximity of the actual date to the half-life of the radiometric chronometer, adequate sample size, so you have proximity, you have an adequate sample size, and adequate sample purity. These are the three most significant conditions for radiometric dating accuracy. The degree to which the sample has been subjected to pressure is much less significant. And really, half-life dependence on pressure applies only to electron capture decays, and that is a totally different context. Small effects have nothing to do with what's being discussed here. But things like heat, cold, gravitational impulses, vacuum conditions, and chemical environment have no significant effect on radiometric decay rates. Thus, young creationist literature purposely mislead the lay audience into thinking that radiometric dating involves inaccuracies when applied outside its limitations. For example, uranium-238 radiometric dating, when applied to young samples, will yield absurd dates. Well, why? It's obvious, because uranium-238 has a half-life of 4.51 billion years, and thus cannot be effective for measuring the age of any sample younger than a few hundred million years. Similarly, carbon-14 will give absurd dates for extremely ancient samples, because carbon-14 has a range between 900 and roughly 40,000 years. You can't go any more than 40,000 years, or 35,000 is the safe limit. So carbon-14 has the added limitation also that it is effective only for dating organic, basically once living materials. Radiometric dating sometimes produces discordant dates, which I think is why Jen was using the word speculation. And again, this is misunderstanding the context of discordant dates. The discrepancies are actually explained by the nature and degree of contamination and by differences in sample sizes. So what happens in the lab is that you just don't date it once. You're dating many times over and over, and the error bars will showcase where you can calibrate and hone on the original, more accurate dating of the substance and isolate the contamination that gives you the odd datings otherwise. So that being said, lead-to-lead dating, which is one particular dating method, establishes that the Earth is 4.5662 plus or minus 0.0001 billion years old, which is a very accurate date. Notice that the error bar is exceedingly tiny now. It's like in the thousandths position there. So, the younger creationist ICR group formed the RATE research group to search for ways to interpret radiometric decay in a young Earth context. After 8 years of research, the RATE group acknowledged that if radiometric decay rates are truly constant, then the universe and Earth must be billions of years old. Thus, the group had no other option but to fall into pseudoscience by asserting that radiometric decay rates must have accelerated by at least a factor of several hundred million times during the creation days and during Noah's flood. But recall my opening argument where I highlight that the laws of nature remain constant. So, for example, in the Bible, Jeremiah 33:25, God says he made a covenant with the fixed laws of nature. And so the key word there is fixed. And he made a covenant. They will not change. They remain consistent with his covenant promises. And science, I showed many parts per billions of the fact that there's no variations in the laws of nature. In conclusion, the smoking gun against this baseless assertion from Jen is the rubidium-strontium isochron method. And I've given you a footnote 9, which is this linked over here, which will then highlight more specifically the visual demonstration of what I'm going to demonstrate here in words. So try and go to the link and then follow along with this, because I didn't have space to put the photos in. So Earth's crust contains abundant crystalline minerals in which ions of potassium or calcium form the cornerstone of the crystalline structure. In such minerals, rubidium can easily substitute for potassium, and strontium can substitute for the calcium. Rubidium-87 decays into strontium-87 with a half-life of 48.8 billion years. But strontium-86, on the other hand, is neither radioactive nor the product of radioactive decay. So this is where things get interesting. A rock with a high original abundance of rubidium-87 will produce more strontium-87 than a rock with a low original abundance of rubidium-87. Thus, even if the two rocks start with the same strontium-87 to strontium-86 ratio, the one with the higher rubidium-87 abundance will end up with a higher strontium-87 to strontium-86 ratio. So if the ratios of rubidium-87 to strontium-86 and strontium-87 to strontium-86 of several different samples of igneous rock formation are measured, the researcher can graphically plot the ratios against one another so as to determine the original strontium-87 to strontium-86 ratio in the formation. Now remember when Jen said this is all speculation? Here's the crux. For many rock samples, a variety of radiometric tools can be used to determine their ages. Thus, different methods using different decay processes, different half-lives, different isotope ratios. So it's not all the same. This is quite a variety. Along with the isochron method, produce the same age, they calibrate one another, and remove uncertainty to the extent that the methods can be considered assumption-free. There's no assumptions. The methods can be considered assumption-free. Okay. Jen then writes, Josephus' origin and Augustine all clearly believed in a worldwide flood. Well, let's see what Josephus actually thought about the flood. So, for the word ark, he used the Greek word lanax, the same word used by classical writers of Deucalion's ark, rather than the word kibotos used in the Septuagint of Genesis 6:14. He adopted the word directly from the account of the Greek historian Nicholas of Damascus, saying that many other people found safety near the Armenian mountains. So it wasn't just Noah that survived. Many other people survived the flood because it was local. It wasn't worldwide. So clearly these ancient historians didn't believe it was worldwide. And furthermore, his choice of the Greek word for ark is significant because the equivalent Hebrew word tavah occurs in Exodus chapter 2 verse 3 for the reed box that Moses was placed in, where he explicitly calls it wickerwork and basket, meaning Josephus calls the box that Moses was in as wickerwork. Why is this significant? Because it's the same word he uses for the ark, which in this case, according to Josephus, the ark is wicker work, not like Ken Ham's, ocean liner that you see in the Ark Encounter. And recall my argument about Genesis 6:14, which this is going to be my third time repeating this, where the Akkadian loanwords show that the ark was made from a reed hut. So it wasn't a massive ark with this, with all this wood and bolts and nails and finally, Josephus used the word diosaso directly, and which is about salvation, directly taken from the Second Temple Wisdom of Solomon text that reads, and these two passages are about Noah's flood. Because of him, the earth was flooded, and the him here is about Cain in the context of Wisdom of Solomon. They're speaking about when Cain killed Abel, that then started off this depravity that then resulted in the flood. And so because of him, the earth was flooded. Wisdom, which is God, again came to the rescue. And since the word wisdom is feminine, that's why it has she here. It's not saying that God's a she, it's just because the word wisdom is feminine. So wisdom again came to the rescue. She took a man who did what was right, which is Noah, and steered him straight on a vessel made of cheap wood. This is in chapter 10. Then, when you skip to chapter 14 of the Wisdom of Solomon, it says, "This is the only reason in the end why humans can entrust their lives to cheap pieces of wood and can reach land safely by riding the breaking surf on a ship that is no more than a raft. Near the beginning, at a time when proud giants were being destroyed, the proud giants of Genesis 6:1-4, Nephilim, the hope of the world, which is Noah, Noah was the hope of the world, escaped on just such a raft." Here's a Second Temple text, pre-Josephus, saying that the ark was a raft. Augustine, to be very blunt and short with Augustine, starting with the creation account, it should be noted that this is what he thought about the creation days. Quote, "As for these days, it is difficult, perhaps impossible to think, let alone explain in words what they mean." So he didn't think of them as 24 hours. He also then added, "But at least we know that it is different from the ordinary day with which we are familiar." Isn't that interesting? He didn't think it was 24 hours. Thus, he understood the creation days in a figurative sense, and because of this, he concluded that the seventh day, since the seventh day lacks evening and morning, it must represent an epoch extending into eternity. With respect to the flood, we read, quote, "The words male and female imply that there was no need to have in the ark such animals as are not born in the normal way, but populate from putrid or inanimate matter." And he followed the Aristotelian theory according to which insects generate spontaneously from putrid matter. This is defined as abiogenesis and was confuted in the 17th century by the Italian scientist Francesco Redi. Basically, I like how Augustine words it because this aligns with the type of species that are allowed on the ark, which is what I was arguing for, and that is a low population farm-like context that Noah had. Then this is what Jen says: "Were Adam and Eve created with those same thousands of parasites?" It depends on what you mean by with. If you mean that Adam and Eve were mortal before the fall, then I agree. If you mean that they existed alongside those parasites before the fall, I agree. As Joel would point out to you, the chaos kampf motif exists right throughout the creation account in Genesis 1, and also highlighted in Psalm 104. This showcases indeed that death, disease, etc. are all part of the natural order. Paul argues this in Romans 8, verse 18 and 22. And due to limited writing space, here's an excellent video analysis by my friend Stan Hope, which I've linked in footnote 21. Jen then writes, "Robert brings up a few passages about God setting the boundaries of the sea, whether they are speaking of creation or the flood. So Robert brings up a few passages about God setting the boundaries of the sea. Whether they are speaking of creation or the flood is unclear. Sorry, Jen, all critical scholars acknowledge that all the passages I cite, Psalm 104, Job 38, Proverbs 8, Jeremiah 5, are an allusion to Genesis 1, specifically verse 2, and specifically the third day in creation, not Noah's flood. To give you an example of Psalm 104, first and foremost, note that it's a polemic against the Egyptian creation hymn to Aten. The very fact that it's a creation polemic against an Egyptian creation hymn shows it's a creation psalm. It has nothing to do with Noah's flood. Here's the structure of the psalm. So days 1 to 6 all correspond to the entire chapter of Psalm 104, and I won't, because I don't have much time, I have the person either pause the video and have a look at, because I give the references to Psalm, chapter, verse, and Genesis. So verse 9 of Psalm 104 clearly states, "You have set a boundary they cannot cross," meaning the water. The water cannot cross. "They will never again cover the earth." Verse 9 is corresponding to day 3, because day 3 is between verses 5 and 13 of Psalm 104. This is about how the land and water become distinct from each other. The waters will never again cover the earth. A global flood contradicts this verse. It then implies David was in error, because David is post-flood. Surely David should know it's a global flood. Why would he say that never again will it cover the earth? Because a few chapters later, it does cover the earth again. I'm sorry, there's a contradiction here. Jen then writes, she writes, Robert, if only ungodly people were destroyed in Noah's flood. And she's referring to my use of 2 Peter 2 and 3. I actually never made that claim. Peter's not making that claim. And as a quick note, I would like to point out specifically that Genesis 6 verse 4 actually again proves my point that it's a local event. Because when you look at the Asher, it's known as the Asher clause verb sequence in verse 4. The grammar is such, as I highlight over here, and I've given a paper, I've footnoted the paper. It's actually a continuation. It describes ongoing action. So instead of saying when the sons of God went in unto the daughters of men, it should read whenever the sons of God. So a global deluge is pointless if its sole purpose was to completely eradicate the evil in verses 1 to 4. Think about it. If the worldwide flood was to eradicate what was going on in verses 1 to 4, and Jen has been touching on this with her Watcher theology, then the Asher clause shows that it's going to repeat itself again, because whenever. If that's the case, a global flood was pointless. And so I view the flood as a natural disaster, an extensive localized disaster, but it was a natural disaster because in that region, the happenings of Genesis 6, 1 to 4 is concentrated in that area. Humanity is concentrated in that area where the Persian Gulf is, Sumer, and so on. And many scholars have written on this. So a natural disaster that then, happens in that region, that God in his sovereignty uses to bring about a certain outcome. But the events of Genesis 6, 1 to 4 continue on each time. So moving on to Joel Anderson. I've only got like 2 minutes left, so I'll just be very brief here. Joel says, such information would have meant absolutely nothing to the ancient Israelites. He's speaking about modern science. And all I have to say is, all I ask Joel to do is reflect on why he and nearly all Christians unknowingly read the scriptures as a sensus plenior. What do I mean by that? Well, Matthew 2 verse 15 sees Hosea 11:1 as prophecy. Yet for Hosea, it isn't. Is Matthew wrong for concording Israel's exodus with Jesus himself? To put it bluntly, the New Testament is a classic example of Second Temple Pesha, or Pesha is another way of saying interpretation. So Second Temple interpretation concording the Old Testament with Jesus. If Joel has a problem with me concording Genesis 1 and Noah's flood with modern science, then he should also have a problem with the entire New Testament. Recall that I don't deny Genesis 1 or Noah's flood having mythic ancient Near Eastern motifs, but neither will I deny the dual application of the text with respect to how it is used in future exegesis for future readers. For example, look at Genesis 3:15, a text that shouldn't be used as a proto-evangelion about Jesus, yet it is used that way by Paul. To put it simply, I am a soft concordist. I agree with Joel that a literistic hermeneutic does not apply to all passages. I agree with Joel that we must always guard ourselves from reading more into the biblical text than what the text actually warrants. Christian theology demands that we are to be good theologians and good scientists. If the Bible is indeed, and so this is my question to Joel, If the Bible is indeed God's message to humanity, would he not inspire the human authors in such a manner that their writings would communicate truth and nothing but truth to all generations? So, truth of a primitive ancient Near Eastern cosmology of Yahweh, and truth to a modern 21st century scientific context. The text can do both. That's where I'm coming from. That's why I don't have a problem with Joel's opening. It's fine from an ancient Near Eastern context. What I'm doing is appealing to the modern 21st century context where the text has the same explanatory power and it has this, it's sufficient to accommodate a 21st century thinking. That's where I'm coming from. And notice what Paul writes. He says, by reading this, which is the letter he wrote to the Ephesians, you will be able to grasp my understanding of the secret about the Messiah. Because remember, Joel said that if God embedded modern science into the text, then it's like this mystical secret stuff in the text, and we can't allow that. Well, then how do you explain Paul's argument that the mechanism of Jesus dying and rising was a secret embedded in the text that no one knew about? And he says, which in previous generations was not made known to human beings. Remember, in Jesus, in Luke 24, he had to open their minds to understand the scriptures. They didn't see dying and rising Messiah in the Old Testament. It was embedded in the text. So not made known to human beings as it has now been revealed by the Spirit to God's holy apostles and prophets. Thank you very much. God bless, and I'll see you guys next time.